As I was studying Proverbs today, or it might have been yesterday, I was thinking about Solomon and his wisdom, and the odd thought occurred to me that if this guy was so smart, why did he have 300 wives? That has nothing to do with anything, I know. But as we will see in our lesson tonight, it was his lapses in wisdom and judgment that really caused a lot of damage to God's kingdom and to his own personal reputation, because he was subject to bad influences from several quarters, among them some of those 600 concubines that he had that came from foreign countries. And of course, he had a union with them and direct opposition to God's instructions that the Jews should not marry foreigners. We continue our study tonight in Proverbs, but I want to announce the next topic. You can be preparing for that by reading chapters 15 and 16 in the book of Proverbs. It has to do with the heart, the human heart. In the New Testament, this part of our being is called the inner man. And man being used as a generic term for human beings, you could call it the inner woman if you want to. But it's that part of us that is spiritual and tender. And, well, I'll tell you all about that next week. So tonight, though, we're going to look at what I have found to be a quite interesting topic, wisdom in government. I just couldn't put wisdom in politics. That seems to be an oxymoron to me, sort of like rap music. But the idea, as one of my college professors said once, she was talking about oxymorons, and she said one of her favorites was male intelligence. Anyway, military intelligence and so on. But God's people in politics, the Bible has a lot to say about politics and government, because governments in those days generally were monarchies, had a king. We have very few of those left today, but we are going to look at what is happening in the area around Solomon, Israel and its neighboring nation, the nations bordering on Israel, Judah, after the divided kingdom, those that came in and took Israel and Judah captive and so on. But what is politics? Well, it's the science of government. Many people study political science. And in a negative way, it's a dishonest management of political parties so that you can get elected by hook or by crook. And so politics has come to have a kind of a negative meaning in the minds of many people. And we are in this season, thank goodness. It's going to end about the same time Halloween does. I'm so tired of horror movies. I'm going to hopefully get John Wayne back again. But anyway, I like Oscar Ameringer's, or Ameringer, I suppose. His take on that, politics is the gentle art of getting votes from the poor and campaign funds from the rich by promising to protect each from the other. What they don't know won't hurt me is essentially what that's saying. Well, there are many attitudes toward politics, political power and so on. There are people who don't want to have any government. They want to do what they want to do. And this was the case, as you'll recall, in the book of Judges, where people did what was right where? In their own eyes. Unfortunately, anarchists are at the mercy of mobs themselves because there's nobody to protect them, to come to their aid. They don't want police to start with because that represents government. And then there are libertarians. There is actually a libertarian party. They're skeptical of government and want less of it, a more personal freedom. And then there's democracy, which we'll talk about a little bit tonight, ruled by the people. It's either pure democracy, as we'd find in Switzerland, or representative democracy, which we exercise in this country, having people to represent us in Congress in Washington. or in the state house, or at the county courthouse, and so on. Well, there are many sources of political power and avenues to political power, and I'm not dwelling on these long tonight. This is another one of those 2 or 3 lesson programs, but I'll restrict it to one. How do we extend power through politics, and how does that power arise? Well, actually, social classes generate power. You think of the dynasties that we've had in this country, and so on and so forth. So we have the Adams family, the real one back in the early 1800s, father and son. We have the Bushes, of course, and then perhaps our most famous is the Kennedy dynasty, which lasted for a couple of generations here in this country. And then we have people who have access to various currency. By currency, that just doesn't mean banknotes, but whatever will buy votes or extend power. It can be property, it can be food. If you are a third world dictator, perhaps in a banana republic, it might be guns that get you power. The people who have the guns make the rules, or it is one of the golden rules definitions is the people that have the gold make the rules. Then personal or group charisma. Some people get elected just because they look good or because they talk good, tell a good story, impress the folks, and maybe just because he has wavy hair. And then there's ascribed power. What we perceive people to have, what values we ourselves place in these people. These can be real or they can be imagined. We just assume that this person would make a good president, a good senator, or a good dog catcher, whatever it happens to be. And then we have social influence of tradition. There are great blocks of voters in this country who always vote the same ticket because they expect something from a politician who gets elected by them, a quid pro quo sort of electorate. So these are some sources of political power. And then the forms of national government, they vary widely, but in the Western democracies, most of them have boiled down to republics or democracies, which are very similar. And in the days of Solomon and other rulers of God's people in that area of the world, a monarchy was the pretty typical system of government. Monarchy means government, and so there's one rule. And this could occur through inheritance or because someone had usurped the throne, taken it over by military action, coup, and so on and so forth. Aristocracy, the rule by the aristocrats or the elites of society. And oligarchy includes a whole range of despotic governments like, well, including colonialism, which America has been guilty of in the past, and many of the crowned heads of Europe engaged in that, of course, the Dutch, the British, the French, and so on. Several along that line had colonies throughout the world and enriched themselves by exploiting others. But this oligarchy includes, Nazism and fascism and the governments that terrorists tend to set up. And then democracy, of course, the rule of the people. Well, the thing is, whether we like it or not, or whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not, God is actually in control. And this is one of the things that I personally have trouble digesting as I look at how history is unfolding, that God is actually in control of this, or He's letting it happen in a certain way to please Himself, or He is nudging history along so that it reaches the conclusion that He had in mind before He even made the world. And this is hard to grasp, and it tends to give some people a fatalistic view of life that says, well, if God is controlling everything, then why should I get involved? Well, actually, we ought to get involved because God is using us also. And He's guiding human activities and human progress or lack of it. And here's the key to it, brethren. We still can exercise our free will. God's in control, but he lets us exercise our own free will. There is a kind of predestination that the Presbyterians and Episcopalians talk about, but it isn't that we have no choice, that God has chosen us to be saved or lost, but he has chosen to save those who will accept him. And then, of course, we think that government is our idea, but it's actually God's idea. He puts kings into place and he takes them away. Here, for instance, we have the well-known situation quoted by Paul in Romans 9 that we can also read about in Deuteronomy, where God, speaking about Pharaoh, says, I raised you up for this very purpose, to display my power in you. So Pharaoh thought that he, by his own strong arm, by his own strong army, by his own will, was punishing or setting free the people of God, but actually God was using him. He was actually, whether you want to call him a tool or an instrument, depends on how you want to look at the means, but he was actually being controlled by God without his knowledge. And the same thing does go for Nebuchadnezzar, who, I read this in one of my daily Bible readings just a couple of days ago. Jeremiah was talking about Nebuchadnezzar, who was an evil despot in his own right, but actually he was carrying out the will of God when he invaded and conquered Israel. And then this idea that God is involved continues as they came into the promised land and as they began to organize their own government. And they were doing this under the auspices or under the direction or under the umbrella authority of God. He set up the kind of government that they ought to have that would be righteous and that would distribute justice among the people. And this is the kind of government we're looking for, one that dispenses justice. And of course, in order to dispense justice, rulers need to be just themselves and to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk, so to speak. And then, as we look at God and government, and this idea that God has prevailed in this area of human activity, that we, because God sets these authorities in place, we need to be subject to them. We need to obey the authorities. And perhaps we feel sometimes that we will have to endure 4 years of whoever happens to be in power, or 2 or 6, whatever the term might be. Still, authority is there at God's behest, and so we need to be obedient to those that are in power. Change that government if we can, but of course by peaceful means. Then, if we ever get to the point where we have to choose between God and man, Scripture makes it very clear, as Peter said before the council, we must obey God rather than man. This is our first choice. Our first allegiance, of course, is to God and his kingdom. And this kingdom, the church, God's rule on earth, so to speak, a temporary rule before we get to heaven and have that eternal relationship and government, God's own just government. We have the church, a realm on earth which is analogous in many ways to the human home, but also to heavenly government. And this was foretold in the days of Daniel in chapter 2 and 44. And if you look at the coming of the kingdom and the spread of the gospel, I intended to make a slide on this, and it just escaped my mind. I think I have it somewhere, but didn't get it in this line. But if you know the term, the Pax or Pax Romana, a period of time about 200 years, about half a century before Christ and a century and a half after Christ, there was general peace in the world. The Romans had control of the means of transportation, communication, and so on, a powerful army. that allowed people to travel widely, and also because of the influence of another kingdom that preceded them that was mentioned in the book of Daniel, the Grecian kingdom of Alexander the Great. Because of that, the Greek language was spoken throughout much of the known world. The New Testament, of course, is written in Greek and Aramaic. And so here, people could travel from Jerusalem and go far to the east, west, and north, and south, clear down into Africa, speaking in the Greek language in many of those places, traveling more or less safely, and this facilitated the spread of the gospel. This also very clearly is part of God's plan, showing that He's in control of governments, even Alexander and even the Caesars. It's a marvelous thought to think that our God is this great, so great that He can actually control history. Amazing. Well, to Proverbs now. Who's reading this book, and what is the message that Solomon and other writers of these Proverbs want to share with us? What are we supposed to what's the takeaway, so to speak, when we read this book? Well, we see that the book opens with a father talking to his son, teaching him that he should be wise. And what better son to talk to than Rehoboam, the son of Solomon himself? Perhaps some commentators think Solomon was addressing many of his remarks to his son who would rule in his stead after his death. And of course, it's good instruction for all the princes and other noble people in Israel and Judah who would have authority in the rule of Israel. So there's a primary audience, but we also can learn from it today, of course, because these are principles that are eternal, really. And in the opening lines of the book, in fact, the first three verses, Solomon says specifically why he's writing the book: to impart wisdom and instruction, to give insight, to cause people to want to have prudent behavior, and to deal in a just and right and fair way. So these are some of the purposes behind the Proverbs as they were originally written. And even though they relate mainly to royal rule, the house of Solomon and the other kings, it also can be transferred or extrapolated into many other areas. Just think the principles in Proverbs can be used in the workplace. They can be used in the army. They can be used in our families, in all of our social engagements, and of course in the church of the Lord. These are eternal principles that they keep their value. They never depreciate like currency that we print does. Well, if we look at government and politics in general, we can use the general catch-all phrase that politics is dirty business. Someone has likened politics to entering a coal mine wearing a spanking new white suit. It's not possible to emerge clean from such an endeavor or encounter, and so sadly, it's much that way in politics. Although I know there are godly politicians, but you have to mingle with people who are not godly, and that's one of the pitfalls that's lurking out there for godly people to go into politics. And some do it and some prevail. Well, tonight we're going to be looking at how we ought to look at political leaders and what the role of government is and what our role is as citizens in government, because our attitude toward government is going to determine to a great extent how we behave as citizens of this or any country, and also as citizens in God's kingdom. And that leads me to this statement, that as Christians, we're citizens of two kingdoms. We have to keep that in mind. And it makes it doubly difficult to choose political leaders, doesn't it? Don't you? I'm sure that many of you have struggled with the choices that you make when you get to the voting booth. I mean, shall I put an X beside of this guy's name or this gal's name? Because of what you may know or about him or her, because what this person stands for. But our primary citizenship, brethren, is in heaven. And that's where we're spending eternity. The Bible tells us that we're strangers and pilgrims in this world, and we need to keep that in mind, but we have to live in the world after all. And of course, since we are under spiritual leadership in the church, then we need to obey those people. And here's some scriptures that will encourage us to do that. And then we have to keep in mind also that we are citizens, nearly all of us. I don't know if Raymond is still a citizen of Ireland or not. He's been here quite a while. But I know several people have dual citizenship. And that means they have triple citizenship then, 2 earthly kingdoms and citizens of God's kingdom as well. Well, because we are citizens of this or some other earthly kingdom, we're subject to the laws of that kingdom. And as Paul says in Romans 13, we are to be subject to the powers that be. And then we have the well-known example of Jesus in Matthew 22, who told the disciples to pay their taxes. He had quite a nice way of doing that, just told them to go fishing. And wouldn't it be nice to just throw out your fishing line and reel in one that had your taxes in his mouth? That'd be pretty good. I wonder if you'd count that as income on your W-2. I don't know if that's ever occurred to me before. But if it happens, I'll see my tax man about it. Now let's look at the idea first of being in authority, how we should behave, and then being under authority. All of us, at one time or another, actually exercise power, control to some extent. Well, as a boss, I've been a work supervisor, and I know that's kind of an interesting challenge. Some of you are in the workplace. You are people who are managers or folks that have authority over a division or a department or whatever, and so you have authority and you wield power to some extent. And because you're the boss, you can make life miserable for the underlings, so to speak, can't you? And I've been on the receiving end of that. Some of you have too. One of the interesting things about bosses is that sometimes they forget that they used to be underlings and they lord it over those that they used to be on even footing with. Parents, of course, elders in the church, these are people in authority, and leaders of any group. These are people who exercise through their leadership and through the power that they control, because of their position, they can extend that power. Well, Proverbs tells us about what's going on in this situation in which we find ourselves when we are in authority. Let's look at a few of these verses. I'll just take the first verse of these because, and you see the others if you want to delve a little deeper into it. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 10. The lips of a king speak as an oracle, and his mouth does not betray justice. So here's a person in a position of authority. He can render sentences and judgment, and those monarchs in those days had the power of life and death, of course. We see that exercised many times in the Old Testament especially, and recently in a sermon, it was just very recently, we see have the example of John the Baptist being beheaded and the king wielding the authority to do that, just on an impulse, actually. And then, of course, to administer justice, if we look in chapter 20 and verse 8, we see when a king sits on a throne to judge, he winnows out all evil with his eyes. And this is an interesting metaphor regarding justice, to separate the chaff from the wheat, so to speak. He's getting rid of all the smoke and mirrors and getting down to the truth of the matter and pronouncing judgment in a just way. So these are the duties of those in authority. And people in authority ought to have certain qualities that would recommend them or that would qualify them for a position in which they make such judgments, a position from which they rule, perhaps an entire nation. And this would make people want to render allegiance to them and consider this person to be a just leader, ought to be righteous. Of course, this is a prerequisite for a democratic ruler. If those such rulers are not righteous, we can vote them out. In fact, I had a sociology teacher when I was in school said it's time to vote all the rascals out. You know, just need to make a fresh start sometimes to be sure we get some righteous people in there. There's always a crop of people waiting to come in, and this is one of the I say objections to long-time rule in Congress. We have people who have been there 30 years or more, and they get established and they have their own cronies, and it's just hard to get rid of them. And some people think we ought to get a fresh batch now and then. But the old school will say, well, they have experience, they know how the system works, and so on. I don't have a particular opinion on that, but I think it's a legitimate complaint. A person who is righteous or wise, this is wisdom. Notice the title, wisdom for those in authority. Those who are wise will be free of evil influence. And that's hard to get around sometimes, because I remember as maybe a 19-year-old sitting in a sociology class in college, and the professor said, and this is the only thing I remember from my class, the only thing I remember, but then that was 60 years ago. He said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Think about that. Which essentially is saying the more power you get, the more corrupt you become. Because the more power you have, the more you can wield that power in a selfish way, the more influence you can get from other people, the more bribes you can get, and your war chest just keeps getting bigger. Another good reason to get the folks out and get a fresh batch every few years. But look at some of these evil influences. Covetousness. You know, what do you covet as a leader of people? You covet power, influence, money, and so on. And of course, power, political power, can lead to power in other realms too. You can get kickbacks from all kinds of folks. You can get stock options and a private jet and use government facilities for your own purpose. There's just no end to it. All this evil influence, bribery. Even the judges in Israel were bribed. The prophets were bribed. And then, of course, we think of Watergate and scandals that we have in Washington, political scandals, sex especially. That was going on, I mean, from the beginning. These things happened because most of the politicians were men, and men, of course, are subject to this kind of temptation and still are. Well, of course, we have qualities now. We mentioned righteousness and freedom from evil influence, and then fair and merciful. If it's one thing, a judge in high office or a ruler ought to have its mercy. And if you look at the big picture of Proverbs, you'll see over and over again a plea for rulers and godly people of all sorts to keep in mind the poor and the humble people, those who have been disadvantaged by life, people who are handicapped, and so on. There's a lot of talk against lazy people, rich people, corrupt people, but everybody is on the side of widows and orphans and the poor. And so this is one of the hallmarks of a just ruler, is that he or she will be just and merciful. Now, those are the folks that are in authority. Well, what's the other side of that coin? Those that are under authority. And by the way, you can have both of those at the same time. There are, for instance, I can think of elders in the church, for instance, who have authority here, but they're under authority in the workplace. And so you experience that. But let's look specifically at those who are under authority. Well, we've all been employed. We know what it's like to have a boss. We know what it's like to work for a living and sweat and be given assignments that we hate, and to be treated unfairly in the workplace and so on. Well, as a citizen, we are under the authority of rulers, and we're subject to the laws of the land and so on. And as children, we all grew up, some of us under very authoritarian parents, and I didn't have those. My dad was a wimp when it came to punishment, for instance. He would say, "Gertie, whip this kid." And she said, "If he takes that belt away from you and whips you, I won't do a thing." Anyway, but he was a good dad. As a child, we're under authority. And as a member of any group, we have leaders. And of course, as a church member, we're under the authority, first of all, of God, and then secondly, of the eldership in a well-organized congregation. Well, what are the duties of these people who are under authority? Often we don't think of their service as a duty, but we do have duties. Since we are under the control, or a better word would be authority perhaps, it could be guidance in the case of parents. And just think, this authority is extended. As a school teacher, I remember very well in the early days of my teaching experience, I was told that there was a nice Latin phrase for that, in loco parentis, in the place of parents. And I had the authority, the principle, to whip a kid within the inch of his life if I wanted to. Well, I never did want to, but that's what parents did in those days. And most parents would send their kid to school with this warning: if you get a whipping at school, you're going to get one twice as hard when you get home. Well, are those days gone? I think they are. But if we're under authority, we need to honor those that are in authority, whether they are in the kingdom of heaven or in the kingdom of Britain or the kingdom of the United States. And this is what the Proverbs is telling us in chapter 24, verses 21 to 22. Let's read that, please. "Fear the Lord and the king, my son, and do not join with rebellious officials, for those two will send sudden destruction on them, and who knows what calamities they can bring." So we are to fear the Lord and King and not rebel. And of course, not rebelling necessarily means to be obedient. And of course, to gain their favor. Well, this doesn't mean to bribe them or to do things to dishonor yourself by groveling before them. But this scripture that speaks of gaining the favor of the king points out the idea that the king can look at you in two ways. I mean, the king can look at you and say, "Well, I'm going to hang you," or "I'm going to bless you." So let's read verse 15 here and see what it says. "When a king's face brightens, it means life. his favor is like a rain cloud in spring. So, if you are in the presence of a potentate, you want to have him smile at you. Remember the case of Esther when she approached the king? Even though she was his wife, if he hadn't extended that scepter to her, he could have beheaded her and might have. So she prayed a long time about that and asked her people to pray too before she went into the presence of the king to ask for his favor, and she was his wife. So, and the queen. So what chance would a lowly peon have under those circumstances? So these are the duties of people under authority. And then we come to this idea of what qualities they should possess. Well, I'll just read these because there are a few slides left, and I know that a brief explanation will lodge in the hearts of this wise audience and bring forth fruit at a later time. Wise conduct. Not all conduct that we see in government is wise, and certainly not all the conduct we see among subjects is wise. I call to your attention the riots that are taking place in many cities in this time, at this time, with the idea in mind that if we, it's an extension of this idea that the wheel that squeaks the loudest gets what? The most grease. And so if you burn a store down, it's going to get the attention of some people in Washington. It's the wrong way to go about it, of course. And I have a sneaking suspicion that many of the people who are doing that sort of thing go from city to city because they enjoy rioting, righteous speech. Certainly, we ought to have that, and we don't see that. Politics are not as nice as they used to be. They never were, never was the cleanest of acts, but it's getting to be very, very bad these days. The people under authority should have pure hearts, and they should work in a way that would justify their position in the kingdom or in the government and so on, as citizens. Control of our appetites, and that can be any kind of appetite, not only in reference to gluttony, but our appetites for power and whatever, money. And then, of course, humility and patience and gentleness. All of these ideas we can take from that list of the fruit of the Spirit that Paul mentions in the book of Galatians. So, these are the people that are in authority and under authority. And in closing, I wanted to just kind of summarize some of the ideas that have been touched upon tonight. What are the attitudes of righteous rulers? How should they think? What sort of persona should they try to project? And how should they behave in regard to those under their rule? This is the idea. So, they should seek wise counsel. If you think about the case before us, Solomon giving out advice like this, he didn't take his own advice really, and his son Rehoboam is the epitome of bad advice takers because he rejected the advice of mature, experienced men when he became king and let his buddies give him advice. And as a result, what happened? People rebelled, the kingdom was divided, and forever God's rule was weakened in that country. It's all because, not all because, but largely because of bad counsel. A ruler should be aware of his own faults, his or her own faults. Every occupant of the White House is a sinner, if you want to look at it that way. A man and woman who are married consist of that's two sinners living under the same roof. We need to recognize our faults. And then, of course, to consider the needs of the governed. People who are in high office drawing high salaries have all the good things of the life that people are only dreaming about who are down there somewhere in the lower classes. So we should keep that in mind. And then realize that their power is limited. Even though we may feel indestructible as we rise up the corporate ladder or up the chain of command, we need to keep in mind that the mighty can fall. They do all the time, really. A scandal can bring someone down immediately. And people can be voted out of office quickly. And of course, time is our great enemy. The strength of youth must necessarily fail. Our supporters sometimes will fail. And of course, we are limited by God. God can put people into power, and he can take people out of power. Life is short, and eternity is long. So, as we look at our rulers and our own behavior under a government, this is really controlled by how we feel to some extent, but those personal inclinations have a background too, don't they? We're influenced generationally by and socially and culturally, and also by our religious experiences. So everybody in this room has a unique set of experiences when it comes to their relationship to leaders or following. And so it's hard to have exact agreement on any issue because of that. But as God's people, of course, we have a standard which should bring us all together and put us, so to speak, on the same page. I won't spend long on this because the old clock on the wall is running against me, but I did want to mention, as we look at the historical aspects of God's rule on earth and the governments of men ruling on earth, that God's people have a history of rebellion, starting with Adam and Eve in the garden. And you see that by the time of Noah, you couldn't find anybody except those 8 folks in the ark who was righteous. And then even after being rescued from slavery in Egypt, these folks rebelled in the wilderness and built a golden calf, for goodness sake, and rejected the prophets. The Old Testament is a broken record of people falling away and repenting and coming back and falling away and never learning, and we follow that same record today. It's a sad commentary on human nature because we let our human nature overrule our spiritual nature. Then, of course, here are some examples of Jews questioning Jesus and Paul and so on. But here are, as we close, I'd like for us to imitate these examples. David, especially when he said, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light unto my path." This is an example of godliness that we can imitate without hesitation and know that it will please God. And then, of course, I like this. The Roman centurion is one of my favorite New Testament characters. Here's a fellow who experienced both worlds. He was a person who had authority over 100 soldiers. But there were several generals and lieutenants and whatever above him who had control of thousands and tens of thousands. And then, of course, there's Caesar in Rome had ultimate control at that time. So he said, I have authority, but I am under authority. And he recognized the authority of Jesus. Just say the word, and my son will be healed. And then, of course, the best imitation, of course, is that of following Jesus, because Jesus put himself in subjection to his heavenly Father as far as will was concerned. And of course, the ultimate obedience was his obedience on the cross and being subject to death, died for us. Well, that is what I have to say about authority, and I hope that's been enlightening to you. Look forward to a heart-to-heart talk next week. Have a good evening. Drive safely.